Hello and welcome to another edition of the College of DuPage Police Department podcast. My name is Lieutenant Munsterman, and joining me today is Detective Derek Jensen. Derek is our department's subject matter expert when it comes to crisis intervention. He has been presenting a class to the college community on crisis intervention for, I guess, several years now, right? Yeah. He's received rave reviews on this class, and we thought that it would be a perfect transition coming out of Mental Health Awareness Month, which is the month of May. Just a little introduction for Derek. Derek's been with our department for about 14 years. He is a field training officer, he's a juvenile officer, he's one of our rapid deployment instructors, and he's also assigned to the Merit Major Crimes unit. Derek, you want to say a few words to get us going here?
Yeah, I appreciate you having me here today. When we talk about mental health crises and crisis intervention, there seems to be quite the stigma attached to it nowadays. Although I do think it is getting better, I think having an open discussion like this is very important. So I would urge all of our listeners today to go back either in the workplace, go back home, and have open discussions and talk about mental health crisis and crisis intervention. I think the more we talk about it and have it out in the open, the easier it is to not only discuss but deal with.
I think crisis intervention is something that we've all dealt with in one phase of our life or another. And if we're speaking honestly and truthfully, we've probably all experienced crisis at one time or another, given the stresses and the stressful nature of our lives. So maybe you can get us going by telling us a little bit about crisis intervention. What is it actually?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to break down crisis intervention is just going over each word. And crisis is a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. And if you were to poll 1,000 people what a crisis is to them, you're going to get 1,000 different answers. Everything's very interpersonal, and I think it's very important to be empathetic towards someone else's situation that when they're going through a crisis, because what a crisis is to me may not be to you, so it's very important to be empathetic about that. What is an intervention, right? It's when we are able to recognize someone that's going through a crisis, taking action, and then trying to mitigate that circumstance and find them the resources they need to get them through that situation.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about empathy and how important that is. And sometimes that's tough for us because we're going through our own stressors in life. And sometimes being empathetic is easier than others. And I know you're going to touch on empathy in a little while and talk about how that's important when we deal with people who are actually in the moment dealing with stress and crisis. What is the ultimate goal of crisis intervention? What are we trying to achieve?
So I always think there's two main goals we have. We have a short-term goal and a long-term goal. When we approach someone going through crisis, they could be displaying a lot of different emotions at the time. They could be having a panic attack. Maybe they're being aggressive towards somebody else. What we want to do initially is de-escalate that situation, get them away from that person or place that's making them agitated, get them by themselves and really kind of listen to them, what emotions they're displaying, and ultimately figuring out what is causing the situation that they're currently in. Long term, we want to get them the resources they need. So maybe it's not us, maybe it's us just talking to them and understanding what they need, getting them those resources. So further down the line, this doesn't happen again. You know, we kind of nip it in the butt, so to speak, and they kind of get that mental resilience of going through this crisis the first time so it doesn't happen again.
I would say over the last decade, crisis intervention has been something that's been in the headlines and kind of a hot button issue in the world of law enforcement. Departments are sending their patrolmen and their officers to crisis intervention training. Many of our guys are crisis intervention trained and certified. So from a law enforcement perspective, the ability to de-escalate and mitigate crisis is really important. But for the community, why is it important? Why is crisis intervention so important for the community?
So just on my day-to-day observations of being a normal person in my day-to-day life, you can turn on your favorite cable news network, watch it for 15 minutes and get really discouraged really quickly. Same thing goes for any kind of social media, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever your favorite flavor of social media is. It's really easy to spend time on there and get discouraged. You mix that with a lot of the polarization of political topics, religious topics, whatever the case may be. It's very, very easy to fall into crisis or get discouraged. And there's a lot of statistics that back that up. According to the adult prevalence of mental illness, 20% of Americans, which is roughly 50 million people here in the United States, are suffering from a severe form of mental illness. And when I say that, again, there's a stigma that's usually attached to that, but that could be someone going through depression, anxiety, or any other kind of disorder or crisis, really. Another interesting statistic that I found was that 60% of Americans have increased their alcohol consumption since the pandemic. So if we're having roughly 50 million Americans suffering from a mental illness, and maybe they're coping with their stress in a negative manner, like consuming alcohol or doing drugs, you could see why there's a giant uptick in numbers of people falling into crisis. So to really answer your question, experts are going to see this trend continue to rise, and it's going to be staying with us for quite some time here.
Derek, those numbers you shared are compelling, and they are evidence that why crisis intervention is so important. From our police department's perspective, over the last 5 years, I think we've seen an increase of about 44% in the number of crisis intervention calls for service that we respond to. It's certainly a weekly thing, and there are weeks where it's almost a daily or every other day occurrence where we're going to a call with a community member who's experiencing crisis or worse. So what are some of the indicators that someone may be in crisis, the emotional and physical indicators that our community members may see?
So physical and emotional indicators are really good tools to kind of recognize when someone's going through crisis, but also preface it by saying, know who you're dealing with. I think a lot of times, I know we work together every single day, so your coworkers, your friends, family, loved ones, we all kind of know what their quote unquote normal baseline is on a day-to-day instance. So maybe you noticed someone at work or your friend isn't getting a lot of sleep anymore, and generally that's tied to someone that has a lot of anxiety. They're getting 3 to 4 hours of sleep a night. Maybe they're a little more strung, their behavior at work, they're short-tempered now, or maybe it's the exact opposite. Maybe they're sleeping a lot, they come to work, they're lethargic, they're calling off sick a lot more, and really their performance at work is dropping. So those are some indicators that are kind of tied emotionally. Maybe they're coming to work and they're more disheveled, they're not taking care of themselves, they're not showering, shaving on a regular basis, things like that. So we call those red flags generally. Maybe you want to pull them aside, talk to them, make sure everything's okay before this continues to spiral and turn into a crisis situation. It is important, though, just because someone is displaying some of these indicators, it doesn't automatically mean they're going through crisis or anything like that. There's a lot of people that generally show no symptoms at all or don't want to share personal information, and that's completely normal too. But it is extremely important to be mindful of that as well.
And I think that all those indicators you mentioned give us the opportunity to kind of be preemptive in our approach, proactive in our approach, and maybe have conversations with people when we have the opportunity to, and just check in on people and say, hey, I've noticed X, Y, and Z. You're not yourself. You seem like you're not getting enough sleep. What's going on? How can we help you? How can I help you? Is there anything we can do to support you? To be preemptive enough to the point where it doesn't manifest itself into some sort of major crisis to where now they're really going into a bad spot. So Derek, what can people do? What can people in our community do to improve their crisis intervention skills?
So there's a ton of different strategies out there and acronyms for ways in speaking to people going through crisis. In my experience in law enforcement that I've been using the last 14 years has been the LEAPS method. I have found that to be the most proactive approach when listening to someone going through crisis. And just to really briefly go over everything, we're going to hit letter by letter as we go down here. So the first part of LEAPS is listening. And what we're doing when we're listening is we're incorporating both verbal and nonverbal ways of communication. Just to go over some of the nonverbal ways of communicating with someone and how important it is. I think there's a stat out there that 93% of communication is nonverbal, and I 100% agree with that. I think it's extremely important because it's really showing you or showing the person you're speaking to that you are listening to them.
Sure.
So generally when speaking to someone going through crisis, you don't want to be shunned off to them. You don't want to be sitting over here or your arms folded in a defensive position, or maybe you're slouched back and listening like this. It shows that you don't care, right? You want to give them as much attention as you possibly can. So you want to have eye contact with them. Maybe you want to be bladed towards them a little bit. Sitting at eye level with them is a huge one as a law enforcement, or maybe if you're just in an authoritative position, standing over someone and trying to get information from them really is kind of belittling in some instances and may not be as useful. So kind of getting down to their level is a huge one in my book. But those are all ways of using nonverbal communication in order to make someone kind of feel more comfortable.
We've got some masters in our department that are excellent at doing all those things that you just mentioned.
Absolutely. And another one, just moving down the chain here, and again, we're going to touch on these very briefly, but the second letter is E for empathy. And I think empathy, everyone knows what that is, right? We're walking a mile in someone else's shoe, understanding where someone's coming from. But it's extremely important not to confuse sympathy with empathy. If someone's telling you, man, I broke up with my girlfriend the other day, this is the worst day of my life, you don't want to say, man, that sucks. Don't feed into that emotion that they're feeling. You want to understand and listen to the emotions that they're feeling at the time. So very important not to confuse sympathy with empathy moving forward. A and the P is A is for asking questions and P is for paraphrasing. This is more the verbal side of communication as opposed to the nonverbal way of communication. When we're asking questions, we want to understand what someone's feeling, the emotions involved. Are they sad? Are they frustrated with whatever's going on in their lives? Do they want to hurt themselves? Do they want to hurt others? What got them to this point, right? And paraphrasing, ultimately our goal in paraphrasing is we're basically just going to be repeating the information that they're telling us so that it lets them understand that we understand where they're coming from and what they're feeling. Mm-hmm. And finally, the last part of LEAPS, which is S for summarizing. Really, what did we learn in our conversation from listening to this person? How can you get them the resources they need in order to really delegate this problem and take care of it so it doesn't happen in the future?
I think from my experience dealing with people in crisis and even today dealing with people who are upset, is the most critical thing for me is listening and then trying to empathize, even if you don't agree, even if you don't see it their way, trying to empathize with their position. And to me, that's the best strategy. That's worked the best for me.
Absolutely. And just to touch even a little bit more on empathy too, I know one way I always tend to really see where someone's coming from is by looking back in instances in my past and thinking, oh man, I remember a breakup I had that was really bad. But don't make that conversation about you. Keep that inside, keep that to yourself, and let that person talk about their issues and just understand where they're coming from as well.
Yeah, I think I have a tendency to kind of turn the conversation along the same lines of what you just talked about. You try to look internally. I can empathize with you because I've experienced X, Y, and Z, and I want you to know that because I think that'll make you feel better, when in essence, it's probably not helping the situation much.
Absolutely.
All right, this has been a great conversation. You've shared just a smidge of the information that you have to offer during your crisis intervention class. If you're looking for more information on Derek's crisis intervention class, you can sign up for that through the EDC, through the Employee Development Center. You can also look for opportunities on our social media, Facebook and Instagram. It's a great class. Like I said, it's received tremendous feedback. We think Derek's done a great job. Derek, do you have anything in closing?
No, just to touch base on kind of what I mentioned before we started talking today, and that's just to be cognizant of it around you. It's nothing to be fearful or ashamed of. I think, I know you said earlier, everyone at some point in their life is going to fall into crisis or go through a tough time. We call it the seasons of life. It's just important to deal with the stress positively. Don't channel any negative energy back into it, and seek help when you feel like you need to.
Excellent stuff. Well, I want to thank you for joining us today and sharing your research and your expertise on crisis intervention. And we look very forward to seeing you all again on the next episode.